We continue now at the top of Daf Chavav Amud Beis in Meseches Sotah. This is Sotah Daf 26b. On the previous Amud, the Gemara brought the Mishnah which said that a husband is able to warn his wife not to go into seclusion with any one of the arayos, meaning he can say, you can't go into seclusion with one of your relatives. And the Gemara says, isn't that obvious? And the Gemara says, no, Ma'od Detema, what might you have said? Nitma shnei pa'amim. The pasuk says nitma 2 times. And echad lebal ve'echad lebo. We learn from there that one is referring to the Baal and one is referring to the Boel. One's referring to the husband and one is referring to the adulterer. As Rashi over here says, Ma'od Detema nitma shnei pa'amim. Amurim Parsha, it says it twice in the Parsha, the word nitma. V'darshinu leila kaman. Later on, we're going to darshan that it refers echad lebal ve'echad lebo. Like we said, it refers to prohibition by the husband and it refers to prohibition that now applies to the adulterer. And what the Gemara is about to say is, the pasuk means to say that through this seclusion, she becomes prohibited to the adulterer, to the boel, to knowing badin sota, because now she's a sota. But in this case, she's already prohibited to the boel. If he's warning her about somebody who's her relative, she's already prohibited to that individual. So maybe this parsha of sota does not apply in that situation. That's what the Gemara now says. The pasuk means to say we're talking about a scenario where it's through this act of znus that the prohibition is created to the boel. But over here, in this case, it was already something that was prohibited. It was her relative, so I would say maybe the halacha does not apply. Maybe she doesn't drink. Maybe the warning doesn't apply in such a situation. And so the Gemara says, "Kamash malon." That's what the Mishnah is teaching us, that a husband can warn his wife. It's considered an effective kinoi, even if it's with any one of the arayos. And the Gemara continues at the 2 dots. The Mishnah said, Chutz min hakatan v'chulu. It said that again, a husband is able to warn his wife not to go into seclusion with any man, but that's to exclude. He can't give her a warning not to go into seclusion with a katan, with a minor, or with somebody who is not a man. And the Gemara explains, Ish amar achmana v'lo katan. It's because the pasuk says the word ish. It says v'shachav ish osa, and we understand that to mean that it is a man and not a katan, not a minor. V'she'eno ish. And then the Mishnah said also, warning is not going to be effective if it's somebody who's not a man. L'mut what is that coming to exclude? What are we referring to over here? Someone who's not a man. If you're going to say we're excluding somebody who is very sick, Rashi over here says his entire flesh is all dried out. He has no strength. And so maybe such a situation, such a warning is not going to be effective. But the Gemara says that can't be the case if you're going to say that. V'amar Shmuel, but Shmuel said on the contrary. Shachaf mekanin al yado. When it comes to a shachaf, we are able to give a warning in that situation. The warning is effective. Uposel betruma, and also if a person has relations with a shachaf, let's say it's a kind of an act of relations which is prohibited, that can create a disqualification from truma. Let's say the woman was a bas kohen, she was able to have truma. If she has an act of relations with a shachaf that's prohibited, such that then she can be disqualified from truma. And the Gemara explains Shmuel, mekanin al yado pshita, the fact that you can warn not to be with a shachaf, isn't that obvious? So the Gemara says, no, it's not obvious. Ma'od detema v'shachav ish osa shichvas zera amar achmona, because the pasuk talks about this other man laying with her shichvas zera v'hol bar hachiu. This person is not able to impregnate her, so therefore maybe it's not shichvas zera. Therefore it wouldn't count kamash malon. That's what Shmuel is teaching us, that she can even be warned not to be in seclusion with a shachaf. Uposel betruma, and then it says also a shachaf can disqualify from truma. Pshita, isn't that obvious? The Gemara says not necessarily. Ma'od detema, what might you have said? Lo yichalel zaro amar achmona. The pasuk says when it talks about this disqualification, it says lo yichalel zaro, and we understand that to mean the islay zara l'chalel. If he has seed, then he can create this disqualification. The leslay zara lo l'chalel. But if he doesn't have this seed, then he cannot create it. Kamash malon. So that's what you might have thought. So it's teaching us that is not the case. Again, by a shachaf as well, it can create this disqualification. And Rashi explains again, mekanin al yado kamo v'havinan, but mekanin al yado pshita. Again, the Gemara is going to ask, mekanin al yado, isn't that obvious? Uposel betruma pshita, and also the fact that there's a disqualification of truma, isn't that obvious? Imhu echon min hapsulim. We're talking about a situation where the shachaf is one of these individuals. Hamechalin is isha is able to disqualify the woman from having truma. Kagon ovid kochavim eved cholol nesin mamzer. Any of these examples in ovid kochavim eved cholol nesin mamzer, they can all disqualify. So that would apply even by a shachaf. The kaimalam bekidushin uvi yavamas to psulin. The poslan isha bebiyasan mivas kohen kisi alish zar. Again, daughter of a kohen, she's with this man. Kaven shenivel olamisha zar etzla pasla. When she has relations with somebody who's a zar to her, who's a stranger to her, so then it creates this disqualification. I might have thought lo yichalel zaro midloksev lo yachel darshinan shnei chilulin echad lav yachel zar. It says yichalel. We understand two things are being profane, two are disqualified. One refers to her, one refers to her children. The islay zera mechal, I might have thought, is only somebody who has zera, saisha, but biyaso, the lesle zera loichal, only again if you can give seed to the woman, you can impregnate her, only that is going to create the disqualification. I might have thought that. Kamash Shmuel, Shmuel the posel. So Shmuel comes and teaches us, no, even in this case of a shachuf, it's going to create a disqualification. Shaminon leimeha, tiyamar mekan alidei shachuf. The point over here is, again, the kinoi works when it's a shachuf, so that cannot be what the Mishnah is referring to. So in any case, now the Gemara is back to its question, and so the Gemara says, ve'ela, rather, what is the Mishnah referring to when it says that you can't warn regarding somebody who is not an ish? So that's going on the following, lemu'ute ovid kochavim. It's coming to exclude an ovid kochavim. Maybe the Mishnah means that if he warns her not to go into seclusion with an ovid kochavim, with a non-Jew, an idol worshiper, that's not going to be an effective warning. But that's not true either. V'amar Rav Hamnuna, but Rav Hamnuna said, Ovid Kochavim mekanan al yado. Again, you could issue a warning with regard to an Ovid Kochavim. Uposel b'truman, also an Ovid Kochavim. Again, let's say she has relations, she's a Bas Kohen, she has relations to a Ovid Kochavim that will disqualify from Truma. Mekanan al yado pshita. And again, the Gemara says, Mekanan al yado, isn't that obvious that you can issue the warning for a non-Jew? Ma'odetema nitma shtei pamim. No, I might have said, what might you have said? It says nitma 2 times, echad lebal v'echad lebol. This is like what we said above. One applies to the Baal, that there's a prohibition for the Sotah to be with her husband, and there's a prohibition for her to be with the Boel, with the adulterer. And so you might have thought, hechad the kamitzra b'haznus. It only applies if the reason why there's a prohibition is because of this act of znus, through the act of the Sotah, that makes her prohibited to the Boel. Aval ha, but over here in this case where it's an Ovid Kochavim, she's already prohibited. So hoel vasur v'kaima, since there's already prohibition to be with a non-Jew, so emalos, I might say that the halachas over here of kinoi and the halachas of Sotah don't apply. Kamash Malan, so that's what it's teaching us, that Ovid Kochavim mekan al yada, the halachas of Sotah do apply. And again, the Gemara asks, similarly, uposel b'truma pshita, the fact that an Ovid Kochavim disqualifies in truma, isn't that obvious? That also is not obvious. Ma'odetema, what might you have said? Ubas kohen kisiya ish zar amarachmon. It says that she's by an ish zar, and it uses the word kisiya. Devar havaya in delabar havaya lo. Maybe it only applies to somebody who, in theory, there could be havaya. There could be marriage with such a person. But if it's somebody who there cannot be marriage with, you cannot have any kiddushin with a non-Jew, with an Ovid Kochavim. So maybe this parsha doesn't apply in terms of the disqualification. Kamash malan depasel mid Rabbi Yochanan. That's what it's coming to teach us over here. Rav Hamnuna is teaching us that there is a disqualification, and that follows the teaching of Rabbi Yochanan. The Amar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Yishmael, because Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, minayin lo Ovid Kochavim v'yevet shavo ala kohenes ve'ala leviyah ve'al bas Yisrael shepasalua. How do we know if a non-Jew, an idol worshiper, or an eved, if they have relations with a kohenes or a leviyah or a bas Yisrael, that will create a disqualification either from truma or from kahuna? How do we know that? Shenemar, because the pasuk says uvas kohen kisiya almona ugrusha. Pasuk talks about a bas kohen. It says it's talking there about a situation where she's widowed or divorced, and she goes back to her father's house then, and she's entitled to truma. And we understand that to mean misha yeshlo almanos v'gerushin, but we're talking about a situation where she's with someone where there's a concept of being a widow. There's a concept of divorce, meaning there was a marriage over there in the first place. Yatsu Ovid Kochavim v'Eved, that comes to exclude an Ovid Kochavim and an Eved, an idol worshiper and a slave, she'ein lo almanos v'gerushin ba, where in those situations there is no concept of being a widow, there's no concept of divorce because there's no marriage. So there again, the Ovid Kochavim, the Eved, will create that disqualification. So again, we're back to our question, what did the Mishnah mean when it said that you cannot warn with somebody that's not an ish? And so the Gemara says, ve'ela, and rather, lemu'ute mai, what is it coming to exclude? Amar Rapapa says, lemu'ute behema, it's coming to exclude an animal. He cannot issue a warning to his wife not to go into seclusion with an animal, and the idea is de'ein znus bebehema, because there's no concept of znus when it comes to a behema, when it comes to an animal. And Rashi over here says, de'ein znus lebehema, eino nazis zona bebeilus behema. A woman is not considered a zona when she has relations with an animal, ve'eino naseres al baal, and that doesn't create a prohibition to her husband. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Rava mi Parzaki le Ravashi, Rava mi Parzaki said to Ravashi, from where is this matter that the Rabbanan said? Where do they learn? From where do they learn that there's no concept of znus by a behema, by an animal? And the Gemara explains Dechsiv, because it's written in the pasuk Lo Savi Esnan Zono Mechir Kelev. It talks about the fact that you can't bring as karbonos the Esnan Zona, that which is given for a prostitute, or that which is exchanged, an animal that is exchanged for a dog. V'tanyan, we learned in a brisa, esnan kelev u'mechir zona. What if it would be the other way around? What if it would be an esnan kelev, and that has to do with relations with a kelev? We're going to learn out this idea that that's not considered znus, or mechir zona, an exchange of a zona. Rashi will explain. So meaning the reverse. If it's not esnan zona and mechir kelev, but instead it's esnan kelev and mechir zona, mutar, and that's actually still going to be mutter. Those are going to be mutter to be brought as karbonas. How do we know that? Shenemar, because it says in the pasuk gam shneim, it says the two of them. So shnayim v'lo arba, it means the two of them, those two cases, esnan zona and mechir kelev, but not four cases, not the reverse. And so in any case, you see from that whole concept that it doesn't apply by a kelev, esnan kelev doesn't apply, it's not considered znus. That shows ein znus lebehema. And Rashi over here says esnan zona, so that's the case in the pasuk. Esnan zona means nasan tleh besnan, and you have a situation of a prostitute, and you pay her with a tleh, so that tleh can't be brought as a carbon. Or mechir kelev, hechlif kelev b'tleh, or let's say you just exchanged a dog for a tleh, so in that case as well, that's not allowed to be brought as a carbon, that animal. And so the reverse situation, let's say you have a situation of esnan kelev, what does that mean? Shem adam omer zona, person says to a prostitute, heilech tleh v'yibali lekalbi, take this tleh, take this sheep, and then you'll have relations with my dog. So now that tleh is not going to be good for a carbon, and now that tleh rather will be okay for a carbon. We don't apply the halacha in that situation, and the reason is, as we're going to say in a moment, the reason is because the act of relations with a kelev, like we said, there's no znus for behema, and the other reverse case is mechir zona. What does that mean? That means haisalo shivcha zona. Let's say he has a maidservant that he has as a zona, as a prostitute, v'achlifa b'tleh, and he exchanges her for a tleh. U'midkamar esnan kelev, and from the fact that it says, this is the point, from the fact that it says esnan kelev over here, and we're saying mutter, esnan kelev is mutter, mechlal the lavs nusu. It's implying that that's not really considered znus, that the act of relations with a kelev is not znus, the is nusu, because if it was nus, havachayil Allah shem esnan, then it really would be considered esnan, and it would be a problem to be brought as a carbon, and so therefore that's the source of the concept of ein znus lebehema. But the Gemara continues, V'yela shichva zera lamali, but if that's the case, what we said above, that a person is allowed to warn his wife not to be with a shachaf, which is a man who has no seed, so what does it say in the pasuk when it says shichva zera? What is that coming to exclude? And the Gemara says, "Miboile," that's needed to exclude the following, l'chiratanya, what we learned in the following brisa, shichva zera. It says in the pasuk, shichva zera prat l'davar acher. That comes to exclude something else. My davar acher. What is this davar acher? What is this something else? Amr Rav Sheshes says, prat l'kashekine law shelo kedarka, comes to exclude. Let's say he issues a warning to her not to be with somebody, not to be in seclusion and have relations with somebody in an abnormal fashion, meaning anal intercourse. So that's not going to be considered an effective warning with regards to sotah. But the Gemara says, is that really true? Amar le Rava. Rava said to him, Shalo kedarka. Shalo kedarka is not considered something you can warn for. But mishkevei isha ksiv. It says in the pasuk mishkevei isha. It's almost using a language of plural, and we understand that to mean that it doesn't matter, even if it's an abnormal kind of be'ila, an abnormal kind of active relations. That's also something that can create a prohibition to the husband. The Rashi says, mishkevei isha ksiv hukshu shnei mishkevosel l'chol devarim. Both kinds of laying with a man are going to be compared to one another, and that does create a prohibition. That's considered adultery. And since that creates a prohibition between the husband and the wife, let's say she would be with another man, shalo kedarka, amai lo avakina. Why shouldn't it be a good warning? So it can't be that shichva zera, that pasuk is coming to exclude a situation where he warns her shalo kedarka. So Elo amar Rava, so the Gemara says, rather Rava says, you know what, it's excluding prat l'shekine law derech evarim. It comes to exclude, let's say he warns her not to be with another man, but he's not talking about having typical relations, but any kind of contact, even other contact of other limbs. That's what it means, derech evarim. So that kind of warning already is not an effective warning when it comes to sotah. So Amar le Abaya says, Pritsusa bialmahi, that's just a situation of pritsus, that's just a situation where she's acting inappropriate. Upritsusa miyasar achmana, would the Torah say that pritsus is going to be something that's actually going to create a prohibition? Rashi over here says, Pritsusa mikasar achmana isha al balabachi. Would pritzus ever cause that a wife would be prohibited to her husband? Of course not. They came with the lo mitzvah, and since that wouldn't create a prohibition, and we know that for sure, bachi, so pshita de lav kinoi. It's obvious that that's not a warning, and you wouldn't even need a pasuk to tell us that. So Abai says that cannot be what the pasuk is referring to when it says shichva zera. It can't be excluding kinei law derech evarim, because then again that's just simple pritzus. That's obvious that it's not included in a proper kinoi. That would not be included as an effective kinoi, an effective warning. So So Elo Amar Abaye, so the Gemara continues, rather Abaye says, you know what it comes to exclude when it says Shechva Zera Prat L'Shekine Lo B'Neshika. It comes to exclude, let's say he warns her not to be with another man, but it's just Neshika, it's just when the two Avarim, when the private areas just touch each other, let's say he warns her even not to go that far, that's not going to be a warning. But the Gemara says that doesn't work according to all opinions. Now that does work according to the one who says that when it uses the term hara in the pasuk in the Torah, that refers to actual entry. At least the tip of the aver has to enter. But if they just touch, if the two avarim just touch one another, so that's nothing. So if you say neshika is nothing, it makes sense to exclude it. That's not going to be an effective warning. That would make sense that the pasuk is coming to exclude neshika. But according to the one who said, but according to the one who says that when it says hara, so it really means neshika, really means just touching, and that also is included in the pasuk. When the pasuk talks about hara, neshika is something. So ma'ikol amemer. So then what are you going to say? On the contrary, he should be allowed to warn her regarding neshika because that is considered to be an act of relations. As Rashi over here says, according to the one who says in Yavamas that when the Torah uses the word hara, and says that is considered like a full act of relations, b'chol harayos, in terms of all harayos, like it says in the Psukim, zu neshika, and that refers to neshika, that's an act of bia. So ma'ikol ameimar. So what are you going to say for that? How can you say that the pasuk is excluding neshika if it's considered an act of bia? Halo kigmar bia hi l'chol davar chutz mi shivcha charufa. That's considered to be a full act of bia for everything except for shivcha charufa. The pasuk over there is discussing a case of an act of relations with a shivcha. That's a discussion over there in Yavamas. But in any case, you see over here that neshika would be considered substantial. And so therefore that kind of warning should be a good warning if you hold hara is neshika. So again, ma'ikol ameimar. And so the Gemara goes back to one of its earlier attempts that really what does shechva zera come to exclude? Liolam l'shekine lo derech evarim. Again, it is coming to exclude the case where he warns her not to just be in contact with another man by way of other limbs, meaning not by an act of relations. And we thought that was obvious. Of course, that's just pritzusa bialma. But no, it's not obvious. Umau detema, what might you have said? Bikpeida debal tali rachmana, that this all has to be with whatever the husband is makbid about. He's strict. He doesn't want her to be with another man in this fashion. Ubal hakakapit, and the husband is strict about it. So maybe that would be. You might think that's a good warning. Rashi over here explains Bikpeida debal talia dechsevikine. It says he issues the warning. Ubal hachazinan leid the kapit. We see he's makbid sharekino lakach. He's warning her about this. So you might think that is considered an effective kinoi, ubal hakakapid, kamash malon. So that's what it's teaching us over here, shechva zera. That's not considered an effective warning. And the Gemara continues, Amar Shmuel, Shmuel says, Yisa Adam, a person should marry, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Chav Zayin Amud Aleph.